Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones alongside Senior Editor Robert Lee Brewer, Managing Editor Mariah Richard, and Editor Michael Woodson. It's our first episode of 2023, and since January is the time of year when everyone is setting goals and resolutions, we thought we would talk about how we as writers define success, because how you define success can and should play a big role in the goals you create for yourself and how you create those goals for yourself. Hey everyone, Happy New Year.
Hi, Happy New Year.
Hi. Happy New Year.
So my first question is kind of a two-part question. Broadly speaking, how did you define writing success when you were younger? And how do you define it now? How has that, your view of that shifted over time?
Well, for me, I guess it's changed a lot over the years. Like if you go like way back, like my original like success goal was like actually finishing something that I felt like, started, had a middle and had an end. I was very good at like starting things and not finishing them, or the idea just starts to build so big that like I would just get overwhelmed and not be able to get to the end of something that I was writing. So early on, I would say just finishing stuff. Over time, of course, like success would be defined by like getting published, trying to get paid for the writing, and those don't always go hand in hand. But more and more, like now, it's changed to where it's probably somewhere in between those types of goals. Anyways, that's mine.
It's so interesting that you say it like that, because I think mine was my trajectory was almost the exact opposite. When I was younger, I viewed writing success as getting traditionally published, like having a book out in the world. The writing part of it almost didn't even factor in. It was just somehow that I'm going to write a book, and the way I will be successful is if it is out in the world somewhere. And then of course, now that like I work this job and I've been thinking about it for so many years and like actually working on the writing, my idea of success is much more realistic, I think. If I write something in a day, I feel successful. Doing that NaNoWriMo challenge last year and writing a large portion of a draft, that I felt so successful when I hit that mark. So it's like I have the writing part of it. I've learned to separate the difference between the writing portion of success and the publishing portion of success. And those are two different things in my mind now. And it definitely was not like that when I was younger, like in college taking writing classes.
I think I'm almost the exact same as you, Amy. I started writing very young, and then when I decided that I wanted to pursue writing, I think I was thinking about it in terms of from a reader's perspective, because before you're a writer, you're a reader, right? Mm-hmm. And I always thought well, if I'm going to write books, then the end goal is to have your work in front of as many people as possible. And that's how you become successful. But I think the older I get, the more that I understand that goals and writing, both separate and together, are incredibly individual. So for me, for my personal success, as long as I'm writing stories that make me happy and keep me engaged, I'm successful, whether or not anybody else in the world sees them, whether or not I'm writing every day or consistently or finishing them. As long as I'm happy doing what I'm doing, I feel successful.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's an interesting question because when I was like a student, finishing stories wasn't a problem or hard for me because there was just the like innate accountability of like getting a grade and it being workshopped. And so like considering success outside of finishing a story, it never occurred to me that that could be a goal or can be seen as successful because I had to do it in school. And then when I graduated, kind of as all what we're saying is my idea of success was just seeing that finished story in a journal or like finished book on a bookshelf, and I wasn't, you know, reaching those benchmarks, and so I kept feeling unsuccessful. But part of that was because I just kept not finishing anything because I didn't have that accountability anymore, and so it took me years to learn that no one's waiting for you to finish this except for you, so you have to finish it. And so learning like self accountability within my like personal creative life has helped me like redefine my success. And right now my definition of success is in just finishing drafts. But I think it's because writers in general, I think we need to start seeing success as a step-by-step process, not as like what the ultimate end goal is.
Yeah, I really love that idea of that step-by-step process. And that kind of connects to the next question I had, which is how did that shift in your definitions change over time? Was it a gradual evolution, or was there like a specific turning point where, you know, something somebody said or something that you read changed your mind about how writing success is defined for you? Because for me, it was a very gradual thing over the course of, I think, working at Writer's Digest and encountering so many different writers. And I think there's been, at least in the writers that I follow on social media or their websites or even agents, there's this shift in, I don't know if attitude is the right word, but it seems like people are offering each other a lot more grace and encouraging people to give themselves more grace when it comes to the goals that they set for themselves. And how chaotic our world has been the past several years, people seem to be giving each other permission to say, yeah, I didn't write today. That's fine. Still call yourself a writer. So I think that has sort of helped me go easier on myself, I think, or give myself those more realistic, achievable day-to-day or week-to-week goals instead of, you will be successful when you've got a book on the shelves.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's multiple ways that my goals have changed. Part of it's just a gradual evolution, like you said, Amy, and you know, every time, I don't know how many author spotlights we put up on the writersdigest.com every week, but it's, you know, usually like, I don't know, 3 to 5 a week, and it's always interesting to hear from writers, their perspective on success and goals, and you know, and not all of them are the same, but there are a lot that you know, there are so many different perspectives that then it like starts to broaden my perspective about what success can and should be. But if I had like one galvanizing point, I think maybe releasing my first collection of poems. That's kind of like you hit that goal where like early on you think like, this is the goal, to get a book, a collection of poems published, like as far as being a poet. And you think, you know, once I hit that, like everything's going to be amazing. And it was a very good experience. I still very proud of the collection. But But I think like hitting that success, like once you hit it, like even before the book gets on the shelf, like I was still excited about it, but then there's also this part of me that's just thinking like, what's next?
Mm-hmm.
Where do we go from here? And you just start thinking about like, okay, I did that. Like, what, my life's not any different, so, so then I just start broadening out, like, what do I want my impact as a writer to be? And what, like, it almost starts to turn into like this existential thing. After you hit that big goal that you've always been working towards, you start to think like, okay, like I did that, but like, what do I really want to get out of writing, and where does success, what is it really? And, I think that just kind of helped like shift my perspective a bit, like in a seismic way.
I think the further I got into my editing career, the more I had to interrogate what writing meant to me and what its role is in my life. Because, like, I mean, up until I was in grad school, I was like, I'm going to be a writer. Like, this is going to be my main focus. But all that time, starting when I was an undergrad, I had been editing and tutoring and like working in these spheres that allowed me to engage with writers in a different way. And then when I left grad school, I was like, well, editing will pay for my writing career. But, the more I've done it, the more that I have developed my editing career, the more passionate I've become about it. So it's not just a vehicle for me to do something else. It is something that like I really put my heart and soul in. So I feel like at least once a year, I kind of sit down with myself and I'm like, so am I a writer who edits? Am I an editor who also writes? Can you be both of those things at the same time? And if so, like, I only have so much time and resources and energy. So at any given point, where am I focusing? And to me, it's helpful to just kind of go with the flow of that. Of like, I don't need to define, am I this or am I that? I can be both, but it is helpful to have those check-ins and to kind of honor that original goal that Amy and I had talked about, right? That like when I was 12 and I was thinking about my future, I still feel joy in receiving feedback from readers on my work. So how will I honor that, and how will I put my time toward it? So I think that's there was no like one specific point, but it's like multiple points that's always kind of happening to me.
Yes, that resonates with me because I in thinking about it, it is sort of like a evolutionary still happening. My goals are changing. My definition of success is changing. Mm-hmm. But I guess the first moment I even was like aware of the fact that like I didn't know what success meant anymore for me was my definition of it started to change purely out of burnout, I think, because like graduating with a degree in creative writing, like instantly I stopped reading and writing because I was just over it and I was overwhelmed and I was like, I don't even know what I want to write. I don't even know if I'm good at this anymore. And I took a really long break from it and got a job at like a digital agency writing like content, but not anything particularly creative. And I wasn't around writers or readers. And then I slowly got back into reading before I moved back into writing, which I think is an interesting perspective, Mariah, when you say like, am I a writer who's an editor, or am I an editor who's a writer, or can I be both? And I do think we are both. And I think naturally one is the other. And I think like my niece over the holidays asked, like, what do you do? Like, what's your job? And I did have moments like, what do I say? Like, do I say I'm an editor? Will she understand that? Do I say I'm a writer? Is that pretentious? It's like, no, because that's what I do. Like, so I just said like, I'm a writer. And it was one of the first times in my life that I've ever said that out loud, which is ridiculous because I've been doing it like as a student and professionally for like over a decade. So like for me, it came from needing to fall back in love with it, naturally changed my definition of it, and it's continuing to change.
I really like that point, Michael, and I think Mariah got me thinking this a little bit too when she was giving her perspective on this. But I almost feel like, because I also went through like a period where, you know, I got out of college and just felt that burnout a little bit, because just doing so many workshops, having so many people talk about what's wrong in your writing,
Rip
like,
you to
you know,
shreds
always
week
trying
after
to
week.
give like positive feedback too, but you just feel like kind of burn out, and then you come back to it to where like I really do feel, and I think this is something after my poetry collection that started to shift, is like it really starts to become about like the success is still being in love with writing and still enjoying that process, and trying to write a better sentence or a better scene or a better poem, or, you know, whatever it is that you're writing.
And I think that, like, I love that you said that, Robert, because, like, if you heard me laughing when Michael was talking, I was not laughing at him. I was laughing
It's
because,
fine
like,
if you were.
the academic burnout is like too real. And I did experience that, but I think it's also like so true that, like, even if you didn't go to school for writing, if you're just living your life and writing and trying to make that dream happen, it can become so overwhelming. And I think everyone probably has a moment where they're like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Totally.
This is really hard. And I think it's totally okay to put it down and to go through that process of relearning to love it and to find that spark again and to come back to it. I think that is like a true joy. And I hope that, you know, people honor that instead of just being like, this is something that I really wanted to do and it didn't work out. Like Amy, when you were talking about like this kind of shift in culture of giving yourself more grace, I think it's good to say like, this is not working for me right now.
Totally.
But you know, maybe in the future I'll come back to it. And I think that's, I feel like writers have a unique privilege, and maybe all artists have that unique privilege of being able to do that, to just put it down for a little bit, to rest, heal, and then fall right back into it.
Well, and being comfortable with that ebb and flow, because I remember specifically one time someone asked me, like, are you still, this was not that long ago, like maybe 2 years ago. I was at a friend's baby shower, and they kept mistaking me for her other friend who had just published his debut novel with, I think it was Penguin, and it was like a big deal. And they kept being like, oh, you just had a book come out. And I was like, that wasn't me, but I'm loving this rumor. Like, and then my friend kept being like, I'm really sorry. I was like, it's okay. I'm actually not that stressed about it right now. Like, yes, of course, one day I would love to publish a novel, but like right now it's not happening. And I'm very comfortable with that. But sometimes that's very stressful for me. And I get really anxious about the fact that I haven't done that yet. And I do start to feel like a failure, but I am recognizing and comfortable with the fact that that is also just the nature of trying something creative, is that like sometimes you sit comfortably in the fact that it's in progress, and sometimes it makes you a little bit disappointed. But I think that comes back to this conversation of success and trying better to celebrate the smaller successes that will eventually lead to the ultimate goal.
Well, I think that connects to what you were saying, Michael, about when your niece asked you what you do for your job, and you had to think about, like, should you say you're an editor or you're a writer or whatever. And I think, you know, we can be very comfortable with having these goals, these malleable goals for ourselves and what success means to ourselves. But there's something about when like people who are not writers
Mm-hmm.
ask you what you do, or if they know that you have written before, or you want to tell them you're a writer, and perhaps you don't have something published yet. The next question they'll obviously ask you after you say, "Oh, I'm a writer," is, "What have you published?" And like, that's the outside
Totally.
version of what success is. That's the general public's idea of what success as a writer is. And so I think finding that balance, or that way to be comfortable with our own definition of it versus what people who aren't writers, who aren't in publishing, think of it.
Totally.
That's kind of something that's hard to come to terms with, I guess. Or it's hard to find a way to be comfortable with having your own version of success that isn't the broader version.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting. The thought just occurred to me because if I tell someone that I write, they immediately start wondering about, where are you published? Like, what successful benchmarks have you hit? If someone tells me that they golf, like, I don't start thinking like, well, what tournaments have you won?
Yeah.
I just imagine you go out and you golf. And it's interesting that with writers, like, I feel so often they feel like they can't say that they write unless they're also going to list off like how they got published. And that's kind of an unfair outside benchmark to attach to it. Not to say that writing's the same as golf, but it is interesting that those two different, like, how that active writing just automatically seems to like say, well, what have you published?
Right.
Well,
or they're like, okay, but what do you really do?
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
To put it, like, to compare it to another creative thing, it's like when you find out somebody is a musician, you don't say, "Oh, like, what venues have you played? What stadiums have you sold out?" Like, that's not. That would be their
people are content like that you can play the guitar or play the piano, right? Like that.
Yeah, exactly.
But with writers, it's it's interesting.
It is. So all of this kind of connects to my next question, because I have been thinking a lot about the idea of taking your idea of success out of the hands of other people and finding ways to reframe your goal so that it's not dependent on other people saying yes or them approving of your work in some way. And like, of course, with some things that's not going to be possible. Like if your goal is to get an agent and you don't get an agent, like the goal is not met. But, or if you want to be published with a traditional publisher, like those are goals that you can't really shift. But there have to be other areas or other ways where writers can create goals where success is in their own hands. And this occurred to Anya Loren Wilson wrote an article in the magazine. I cannot remember which issue, but she was talking about something about setting goals and or it was like pitching story ideas or something like that, and she reframed it and said, instead of focusing on like the goal of getting the agent, make your goal to pitch X number of agents, so that when you have done the pitching, you have achieved something. Because putting your work out in the world is a big deal. So, I mean, getting the agent might still be the ultimate goal, but there are other ways to achieve certain benchmarks along the way that can be fulfilling. So are there other...
I think that's a really good goal. I know when I was submitting poetry, something I really haven't been doing in the past few years, but when I was doing it a lot more frequently, that was sort of how I approached the submission process, almost with and I don't want to say like fatalistic, like I'm going to get rejected, but like I wasn't as focused on the acceptance as much as keeping the poems moving and in circulation as far as being on submission somewhere. And my goals would be like to submit, and I had a lot of poems to submit, and then you usually submit like packages like 3 to 5 poems to publications at a time. So like I'd have my submission tracker, and I would have like a goal like to submit to like 3 places a week, and I would just do that, mark it in my submission tracker, and then if stuff got accepted, great. If it got rejected, it would always be like a time where it's like, okay, I've been away from these poems for a little while. Do I think I can tweak them at all? Sometimes I could, sometimes I couldn't, and then send them out again. And that, so like the goal really wasn't like the yes or the no. It was like, just keep it moving. And then over time, the acceptances build up to where then I'm like, all right, now I'm going to try to put a collection together and try to get that published. So I think that's a really great way to like kind of put the measure of success, the metrics into your own hands instead of like the hands of like, you can't control whether an editor's going to be into your pitch a certain day or month. And as an editor, I can say like the things I'm interested in, it does change from time to time. There are some pitches that come in that like I'm probably going to accept them 10 out of 10 times, but there's other ones where it does depend where I'm at as far as like our content mix, what we've recently done, and all that.
I think for me, the key was a shift in my perspective that actually happened like very recently. So Amy, I love how you phrased it as like taking it out of the hands of other people. So for me, how I have reframed is looking at hopes versus goals. So for example, going into 2023, before this shift in perspective, I would have said, my goal is to get a story published in 100-word story by the end of the year. That's a goal. But at the end of the day, I can write 10,000 stories and submit them all, and all of them are rejected, and that's not my fault, and it's out of my hands.
Right.
So looking at what I'm thinking of as a hope. I hope to be published in a 100-word story by the end of 2023. That's the hope. So the goal is, okay, well, I'm going to submit X number of stories, or I want to have these 3 stories really, really polished in the next 2 weeks so I can submit them by this date. Those are actionable goals that I have total control over. That push me toward that hope. So I think that's like I am not a failure just because this really big thing that I wanted didn't happen. And it's to me, submitting writing always feels like job hunting.
Oh, 100%.
Because like you could be perfect for this position, but there's 1,000 things that are going on behind the scenes that have nothing to do with you that mean that you don't get the job. And it has nothing to do with who you are as a person, what your resume looks like, etc. And it's how writing is too, right? Like you could have the most perfect story, but maybe they've already filled up their issue, or maybe they've already accepted something that's very similar. Or. There's just 10,000 other things that you will never know. So to like kind of let go of that unknowing and to say like, I've done everything I could on my end that has had me meet my goal. So I think I'm hoping to take that energy into 2023 and stop obsessing over things that I can't contror.
I love that so much.
Well,
hopes
Me too,
versus
me
goals,
too.
like that whole thing, that was perfect.
I wrote it down. I love that so much.
well, and also recognizing that like or deciding maybe that like an end goal is different than personal success, especially like along the way. And I think I wrote about this in one of our writing mistakes writers make pieces online, but I think writing is like very as a unique art form in that it's one of the few that we don't get to see the step-by-step process. I wrote for an art magazine, or I edited for an art magazine for many years, and part of that was artists would submit their literal step-by-step process to help other artists. Movies and TV have making of featurettes. Even musicians, like you can see them in the studio. And so for a lot of us who are trying to write or who are actively writing, it's too easy to feel like a failure when the only thing we see is the finished product. And I think that deciding then to celebrate the small successes in between and what those mean for you, even down to the kind of rejections you get can still be successful. Because as a personal anecdote, I've submitted to this one literary journal that I greatly admire several times, and I've gotten rejections that are, very, thank you for submitting. This isn't the right home for us, but please submit again. And then one specific one that was so sincere and a very close read, told me like, this is what we loved about it. We loved this. We loved this. We thought this could use some work. And as it is right now, we're not the home for it. And that told me two things. One, that it was very barely a rejection. And two, like they offered me like basically like a free workshop and told me like, fix this part. And if you do, then we might like are more likely to accept it. And to me, that was like a successful rejection, and has helped me recognize the smaller successes that will hopefully lead me to my end goal. But I think that it is just I don't think this is unique. Like I think most writers feel this this push and pull of like, am I successful because I haven't met my goal? It's like, well, yeah, because everything you do to get closer to that goal is a success.
Yeah, and that's there are like two great points there. Like one is as far as like the finished product, like that's what we see. So we think, when we write like, oh, I wrote my first draft, it's nowhere close to like what this published thing is. Well, that published thing was probably gone over by several different editors and rewritten many times, even after it was accepted. I mean, that's one thing that the more interviews you read with authors, the more you realize that you make it as perfect as you can, but then editors and agents are still going to possibly have you rewrite the whole thing. Because there's something that they loved about it, but they think that it can get better. But then the other thing is like we see other authors, other writers, success moments and think, wow, look at that success moment they had. They got published here, they got published there. And what's often lost is that they might have submitted to that place 20, 30 times, like that specific journal, before they were finally accepted. And but what we see is like that publication credit and think, wow, they got published there. Like I never get published there. Well, they probably were never published there either until they were. So
yeah, it's like when at the annual conference last summer when Marlon James was talking about like the number of rejections he got when he was searching for an agent. Like we only know that he has an agent and he's published these books and he's a great success, but before all that came the 75 or 76 or however many it was rejections and the burned manuscript in his backyard.
Yeah, he almost, I mean, that literally almost never happened because he was driven to the point where he thought like I'm a failure and burning the manuscript to where then he has to try to hunt down like I mean, that shows you how close like how thin the margin can be between success and failure as far as how other people measure it. And it's always the saddest thing to me is hearing people who say like that they wrote a whole book or wrote a few books and that they just quit writing because they haven't been published.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel wow, they had enough energy to write a book or multiple books, but then they let these other, I guess it would be in the hopes column, like crush their ability to keep like chasing their goals and keep writing, to where they probably would have eventually found success if they kept at it.
Mm-hmm. Well, while we're talking about measurements, are you a fan of creating like metrics for yourself or ways of tracking your progress or setting benchmarks towards the things that are goals? And if so, like, how do you do that for yourself? And Robert, you mentioned you had a submission tracker for your poems.
Yeah, so for submitting my poems, especially because, well, I think it's helpful to have a submission tracker if you're going to do any like significant submitting. If you're only submitting like one manuscript to one place and then waiting for them to respond, then I guess you don't need a submission tracker. But a lot of people will do simultaneous submissions. And with poetry, when you're doing batches of poems, I find like it's really helpful to know where everything is and where it's out to at any given time, because if it gets accepted somewhere, you want to let other people know that this poem is no longer available. But yeah, so like that's very helpful for just like managing that. As far as like metrics, I used to try to do metrics for my writing, like as far as like hitting specific word counts and all of that. And it was actually during Mariah's February Flash Fiction Challenge last year, when the goal is to write 1,500 words or less a day, that my fiction writing really started to open up on a daily basis, because I was putting a limit on how many words to write each day. And somehow that made it easier to write than thinking of hitting a benchmark of like trying to write 500 words or trying to write this. Ironically, like trying to keep it under 1,500, I was like going over, I think when I crunched the numbers after February is over, I was like averaging like 900 words a day or something like that, trying to keep it under 1,500. Whereas if I had come in with the goal of like write at least 500 a day, I probably would have failed. so for me, that like kind of changed my viewpoint on how I look at the goals and how I measure, and trying not to stress out so much about like hitting a certain goal, because then if I start to miss it, then I start to get down on myself and go the wrong way.
Anyone who knows me and everyone on this team will testify that I love a good spreadsheet. So I don't know if I have my ADHD brain to thank for that or what, but having data and metrics is always super helpful to keep me on track, but also to visualize everything that I'm accomplishing. So for me, like a submission spreadsheet is not only helpful to like see where things are at any given point, but just to be able to look back and be like, wow, look how much I submitted this year compared to last year or 5 years ago. But this year I am doing something a little bit different. So for the holidays, as a gift, I gave me and two very close writing friends all identical teeny tiny journals that you can like easily throw in a bag and kind of carry with you. And we each took a turn with each other's journal, and we wrote one hope and one goal that we have for each other for this year. And then after we read the goals and hopes that we had for each other, we had to write down one for ourselves. So that was like when I was talking about 100-word story, like that is my hope for this year. So I'm like framing my goals around that hope specifically. And that has made things feel nicer. But if you are interested, anyone who's listening and anyone on our team here, if you're interested in goal trackers, I really, really highly recommend passion planners. So it's a physical planner that you can buy and have sent to you. They have quarterly ones and they have yearly ones. And the yearly ones are really nice because you have to do a lot of kind of like goal setting, and it's very creative and dynamic on the page. And you have to like fill in bubbles and all this stuff. And then every quarter, it asks you to check in and kind of journal about it. But they do have a bunch of free downloads on their site. So they have like day-to-day goals. You can make your own like 30-day challenges for literally whatever you want. It doesn't have to be writing. And they also do have multilingual options for their planners, which has just in the past been really helpful to, again, like I'm somebody who needs the constant check-in throughout the year. Like, how am I doing? Do I need to pivot? Do I need to do something different to help make this happen? And Passion Planner has been super, super helpful for that.
Yeah, I'm not a benchmark person, and I really wish I was, and it would probably help. But I'm not, it just doesn't, I've learned right now in my life that it is more of a hindrance than a help for me, because it's really like a surefire way to make me feel like I'm failing, because if I don't have it in me that day or something and I don't meet that goal, it's just like too much of a visual reminder that I didn't meet it. And so yeah, no, it doesn't help me. But I've learned that, and I wish this was true in school too. Like writing prompts don't really help me, and every time I try, I wish they did. So what I've learned is that, like, I think because it was felt like such an assignment, an open assignment in school to write a story, like if I'm given that opportunity now, I'm way more successful. And an example being that a few years ago, a friend of mine was putting together a creative writing podcast for Pride Month, and she reached out to her queer friends who she knew were creative writers and asked them, like, would you mind writing a short story to be read on the podcast, and then I'll interview about it. And I was like, absolutely. And that like pressure to be like, it needs to be done by this time so I can read it and we can record it. And sort of like an open, like it has to be just sort of it has to be queer in nature. I finished it in a day, and I've never written that fast. And I was like, this was awesome. I feel really energized. I've kind of been chasing that feeling ever since. Can't find it, but that is like, I guess my version of a benchmark is being like, here's a sort of broad assignment, finish up by this date. And if I think about it in those terms, I'm way more likely to find success in my writing. But
I like that you said that, the benchmarks and goals don't work for you right now, or the benchmarks, not necessarily, not the goals part, but that the benchmarks or tracking doesn't work for you right now. Mm-hmm. Because I think leaving space for your working habits to change over time as you grow and become a different person is really important. Mm-hmm. Because I've gotten hung up before on like, well, this is the way it worked for me the last time. That doesn't mean it's the way it's going to work for you this time. And understanding that is really important, I think.
Well, and I think the way we've been talking is really helpful, especially to me, because I think writers need to think about their success or chasing it as being present tense. Because mm-hmm. when we think like, I'm not going to write because it didn't work for me, like we need to think it hasn't yet, like it hasn't worked yet. And thinking about it as like an activity and like an active thing, even within our conversation, has been really helpful for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Each time I read an interview with an author, like, not all authors touch on this, but like it's interesting how many authors do talk about how there's a process that worked on X book and Y book, but then Z book, that process just wasn't working, and then they they start to almost doubt themselves then, and then all of a sudden some kind of new process is the way that it had to be done for them to get that next book out. So I like that thought that, don't get like, even if you have like a process that's working right now, like don't feel like you always have to keep that process, because eventually, uh, like sometimes I feel like a thing that can really block people with their writing is um, just getting married to like the certain process, and then if it's not working, if it's not working for them, like they think, well, I'm just done writing. I can't write anymore. When actually, maybe it's just like kind of changing your mindset, or maybe it's
Mhm.
walking away for a while and uh, giving yourself space so that you can come at it with fresh eyes and a new
Totally.
love for it.
Well, I think that also connects to the idea that, if something doesn't work, if it works for you one time but it doesn't work for you the next time or on this other book, I think it also connects to the idea that what works for other writers won't necessarily work for you. And because
Mhm.
X writer finds success in writing every single day, and that's the way that they get their work done, um, doesn't mean that process is what works for every other writer or what
For
will
sure.
work for you. Um, that was another thing that kind of impacted my thinking when I was younger, and my idea of success was, I would go to these these author events at bookstores, and people would ask the question, like, what's your writing process? What pen do you use? And I know that's like the stereotypical question, what
Yeah.
notebook and pen do you like to use? And so I got hung up on that. What worked
Mm.
for, if I loved this author, I need to emulate the way that they work to find that same success. And like, hopefully we don't need to say that that's not the way it works anymore, but there are always new people coming into writing. And so we should say that's not the way it works. What works for you is going to be different than what works for every other person.
Yeah, totally. And I'm a poet that's married to a poet, and I don't know if I've talked about the difference between my writing process and Tammy, my wife's writing process, before on here. If I have, I'm sorry for repeating myself, but I'm a poet that likes to write poems rather frequently, and um, it's just something like I like to do. Like, I don't even worry about whether it's publishable or not. So I'm always writing stuff, and a lot of it, like, after a week or so coming back to it, like, I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything with this, but like, it was fun to write it.
Mm.
Um, Whereas, and eventually, like, there'll be poems that come out that I start to feel like, okay, well, this one I might be able to get published somewhere. Meanwhile, my wife Tammy, she will go long stretches, like sometimes like a year or more, without writing a poem. But then, like, she might be working on an idea in her head, like, that whole time, and have some different images in her head. And she'll just go like long stretches without writing, and then all of a sudden, like, the poem finally is right into her head where she gets it out, and it's incredible. And that's just how she writes. And then she'll go through it, and like, her revision process is like wild, because I will think that it's like the most amazing poem, and she'll still sit on it for another couple years, because there's something about it that she thinks it is pretty good. Like, she'll even say like, it's pretty good, but she feels like there's something else that can improve it. And so it's interesting, like, thinking about that, like, everyone's process being so much different, uh, how they come at it. If that there are people who are closer to being daily writers like myself, like, I like to write a lot just for the sake of writing. But then, if if you just write in spurts, like there's nothing wrong with that. That's how you process stuff.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I think I had like a breakthrough moment. I think other people did too with Mariah's hopes versus goals idea. I kind of want that to be my motto for the year. I don't know about the rest of you, but I thought that was fantastic. All right, well, our writing prompt for this episode does kind of connect to that idea. Create a writing-related goal for yourself. It can be craft or publication-based, and you can create metrics or stepping stones so you can see your progress toward that end goal. But be sure to find a way to keep the success in your own hands instead of solely based on the approval of someone else. In other words, create your hope and create your goal. Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Be sure to join us next month when we'll be talking about romance novels and romance in novels. In the meantime, you can always find us at writersdigest.com and on social media at Writer's Digest. See you next time.